Here to introduce Richard Dawkins, we have Professor Robert Siegel. He is a professor in microbiology and immunology, and a perennial favorite among the students here at Stanford, who has won numerous distinguished teaching awards, including the Gores Award for Excellence in Teaching. Please welcome Professor Siegel.
Thank you. On behalf of the Humanist Connection and the atheists, humanists, and agnostics at Stanford, it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Richard Dawkins. Professor Dawkins is well known to most members of this audience through his books and his public appearances. He is the recipient of numerous awards and even has a genus of fish named in his honor. Maybe someday there will be a shellfish gene named in his behalf. Richard Dawkins began his scientific career as an ethologist. He earned his PhD from Oxford University analyzing pecking behavior in chicks. And he was a pioneer in the use of computer programs to model aspects of animal behavior and evolution. However, most of you will be familiar with Dr. Dawkins' work in two other arenas. First, as an explicator of science and a popularizer of modern evolutionary theory. His elegant prose, lively examples, and memorable metaphors have done much to engage the public in this extremely interesting subject. He has been a staunch defender of Darwinian and neo-Darwinian theory. To a great extent, Dawkins' fame began in 1976 with the publication of his first book, The Selfish Gene. Right from the beginning, Dawkins' views of genes as replicators were seen as controversial. However, it is precisely the power of his ideas to generate interest, debate, alternative hypotheses, and experimentation decades after their initial publication that underscores the importance of Professor Dawkins' contributions. These areas are of singular importance in virology, which is my main focus. For instance, we can analyze the potential speed of viral evolution in Dawkinsian terms of fecundity, replication fidelity, and generation time. Professor Dawkins' notion of a unit of cultural transmission, or meme, a term that he coined, has itself become a powerful meme. Moreover, the meme has demonstrated various properties of replicators, including mutation, selection, and evolution. From 1995 until 2008, Dawkins was the University of Oxford's Professor for Public Understanding of Science. The second arena in which you may know Dr. Dawkins is he's become prominent as an outspoken atheist. In particular, he is focused on the detrimental effects that he attributes to religious belief and religious education. And most recently, Professor Dawkins has published his autobiography, An Appetite for Wonder, The Making of a Scientist. In reading An Appetite for Wonder, I was quite interested to see that much of the book takes place in southern and eastern Africa, in Oxford, and in Berkeley, three places where I have also spent significant portions of my life. In fact, we both stayed at the same Lion Research Station in Botswana, unfortunately not at the same time. I was also struck by certain comparisons between Dawkins and his hero, Charles Darwin. Here are some of the Darwinian comparisons. First is the obvious similarity between their family names, Dawkins and Darwin. Second, they share the initials CRD, Clinton Richard Dawkins versus Charles Robert Darwin. Third, they both came from British families of some prominence, including a strong tradition in science. Fourth, Dawkins published his first book around age 35, Darwin at 30. Fifth, they both wrote a large number of books, mostly about natural history and evolution. Sixth, they both experienced a major change in life course after the publication of a particular book. For Dawkins, it was The Selfish Gene. For Darwin, it was The Origin of Species. Seventh, they both grappled with issues of religion versus science. And eighth, they both have written autobiographies, Dawkins at age 72, Darwin at 67. Coincidence? I think not. This evening, Professor Dawkins will be interviewed by Greg Stikeleather, serial entrepreneur and senior advisory board member of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. And with that, I give you Professor Dawkins.
Nice crowd tonight. An appetite for wonder. Richard, you start describing many generations before you, your early life growing up in Africa, school back in England, Balliol College at Oxford, your appointment to Berkeley in the 60s, and then the publication of your first book, The Selfish Gene, when you were 35 years old. I should have given a spoiler alert. That is the book. But it's a fascinating book, so well written. And I was wondering if we could start, if you could read a little about from the Clinton and the Cannonball. And I'll let you explain what that is for folks.
Yes, I did start by talking about some ancestors, really just for the fun of it, because the number of genes I share in common with them is not great. Of course, the further back you go, you divide by 2, and so there's not a lot there. But there's one, quite a lot of them were called Clinton, as unfortunately am I. There was one called Clinton George Augustus Dawkins, who was the son of Henry Dawkins, 1765 to 1852, who eloped with the daughter of General Sir Henry Clinton. I remark that it's rather a cheek of the Dawkins family to pinch the Clinton name, since they only acquired relationship to the Clinton family by this elopement, in which, in 1788, his daughter, General Clinton's daughter, eloped from this street in a hackney coach with Mr. Dawkins, who eluded pursuit by posting half a dozen other hackney coaches at the corners of the street leading into Portland Place, with directions to drive off as rapidly as possible, each in a different direction. So I rather admire Henry. Henry and Augusta's son, Clinton George Augustus Dawkins, 1808 to 71, was one of the few Dawkinses actually to use the name Clinton. If he inherited any of his father's ardour, he nearly lost it in 1849 during an Austrian bombardment of Venice, where he was the British consul. I have a cannonball in my possession, sitting on a plinth, bearing an inscription on a brass plate. I don't know whose is the authorial voice, and I don't know how reliable it is, but for what it is worth, here is my translation from French, then the language of diplomacy. One night, when he was in bed, a cannonball penetrated the bed covers and passed between his legs, but happily did him no more than superficial damage. And I go on, this narrow escape of my ancestor's vital parts took place before he was to put them to use. And it is tempting to attribute my own existence to a stroke of ballistic luck. A few inches closer to the fork of Shakespeare's radish and... But actually, my existence and yours and the postman's hangs from a far narrower thread of luck than that. We owe it to the precise timing and placing of everything that ever happened since the universe began. The incident of the cannonball is only a dramatic example of a much more general phenomenon. As I've put it before, if the second dinosaur to the left of the tall cycad tree had not happened to sneeze, and thereby failed to catch the tiny, shrew-like ancestor of all the mammals, we would none of us be here. We all can regard ourselves as exquisitely improbable. But here, in a triumph of hindsight, we are.
Right. You started writing the book after your father passed away, but your mother was and still is alive. How much did you know about your family history beforehand, before you wrote the book, and when and how did you learn it? And how much new research did you have to do for the book?
My father was quite keen on family history, and his mother was even more so. And so I sort of knew these names like Henry and Clinton, George Augustus, and these family legends had passed down, and the cannonball was always on view in my father's house, and it's now on view in my house. And I could just about decipher the French inscription. It's rather faded. So that was sort of familiar to me. I then had to look up actual family trees to get the exact details. I did talk to my mother quite a bit. I even recorded conversations with her. I'm not very familiar with the art of interviewing with a recorder, but I did with my mother. She rather enjoyed it, I think. And so that helped me a lot, because her memory of my early childhood is very good.
Mm-hmm. Anything especially surprising that you learned?
Well,
over the entire book when you were doing the research?
I think there was one instance of possible false memory on somebody's part. My mother and I disagree about exactly what happened. We agree that I was stung by a scorpion because we lived in Africa. And my memory of the incident is extremely clear, but hers is different, and which is interesting. I mean, that false memories do happen. My memory was that I was walking across the floor and I saw what I thought was a lizard. I used to think I ended up as a biologist and confused a scorpion with a lizard. Anyway, I thought it would be fun to let the lizard run over my foot. I was barefoot. I didn't tread on the lizard. I wouldn't do that. But I did put my foot in the way of it, hoping it would run over, and I could feel the sensation of it running over my foot. And the sensation I actually felt was a burning, stinging pain. And I think I passed out. And 3 Africans who were in the vicinity heard my screams and came rushing in. And they tried the technique you use with snake bite, which is to suck the poison out. I don't know whether that works with scorpion stings. I doubt it, but it was nice of them to try. My mother's memory is different. She says that I got down from the table at a meal and accidentally trod on the scorpion which was under the table. But my memory is so clear of watching this thing that I thought was a lizard that I'm sure I'm right.
You mentioned a couple of spanking incidents in the book in the context of school. Were spankings frequent for you, and were you ever spanked at home?
Never at home. At school, yes. I mean, I'm old enough to have gone to school at a time when caning was still done at the sort of boarding schools that I went to. And it was pretty nasty.
So say what that is.
Well, it's a cane. Our headmaster, whose name was Gallows, his real name was Mr. Galloway. He had 2 canes, Slim Jim and Big Ben. I only ever had Slim Jim, thank goodness. You had to bend over a chair and were given 3 strokes, 4 strokes, 6 strokes with the cane. It was quite bad. I mean, you got real bruises. I mean, one bruise for each stroke of the cane. Real purple bruises turning yellow with time, lasting about 3 weeks, I suppose. We used to show them off to each other in the dormitory as sort of battle scars, like dueling scars in German universities.
Right. And not all the housemasters were severe. There was an incident in the book about housemaster Mr. Ling, confronting someone in their dormitory room.
Yes. Shall I read that?
Yeah.
Yes. This was at a later school. When I was... this happened, actually, the term after I left, I think. Mr. Ling was my housemaster at the school.
How old were you at this time?
18. Mm-hmm. And I've said here, Mr. Ling was in his way a decent man. A contemporary and friend of mine in the same house recently told me the following nice story. He was illicitly up in a dormitory during the day, kissing one of the housemaids. The pair panicked when they heard a heavy tread on the stairs, and my friend hastily bundled the young woman up onto a windowsill and drew the curtains to hide her standing form. Mr. Ling came into the room and must have noticed that only one of the 3 windows had the curtains drawn. Even worse, my friend noticed to his horror that the girl's feet were clearly visible protruding under the curtains. He firmly believed that Mr. Ling must have realized what was going on, but pretended not to, perhaps on boys will be boys grounds. "What are you doing up in the dormitory at this hour?" "Just came up to change my socks, sir." "Oh, well, hurry on down." Good call on Mr. Ling's part. The boy went on to become probably the most successful old boy of his generation, the knighted chief executive officer of one of the largest international corporations in the world, and a generous benefactor of the school, endowing, among other things, the Peter Ling Fellowship. That was, I haven't said it in the book, but that was Sir Howard Stringer, who became the chief executive officer of the Sony Electronics Corporation. I think the only non-Japanese ever to have held that post.
Came up to change my socks.
Yes. Well, he didn't have much time to think.
So great that he bought that.
Yes,
Well, yes, of course, you have to change your socks. How old were you, and what were the circumstances that when you knew that you were an atheist?
About 16. The circumstances were discovering the beauty and power of Darwinian evolution, because before that I had been rather persuaded by the apparent intelligent design of living things, the powerful illusion of intelligent design. And so it wasn't until I really understood Darwin that I gave it up.
Mm-hmm. You said you just scraped by getting into Balliol College at Oxford. Now, this is where your father and grandfather had gone. Do you think that this legacy was a factor in your being admitted?
Well, it was more than just my father and grandfather. I think 11 members of the Dawkins family went to the 6th. So naturally, that thought, that ignoble thought crossed my mind, that I might have got in because of that. I was regarded as a bit of a borderline candidate, but when I actually went for interview, it was largely done on interview, and when I went for interview, as it happened, the interview went brilliantly well. I just happened to have the luck to be asked questions that I could answer and could thrive on. So I think that was one of my lucky breaks that I got. I did get into Oxford, but I think by the skin of my teeth. And then I think, that really was a lucky break, because insofar as anything was the making of me, I think Oxford was.
It's a great segue to my next question. You say in the book that Oxford was the making of you.
Okay.
How was Oxford the making of you, and who there made an impact?
Right. I didn't do very well at school because I think I had the attitude that learning was all about mugging things up in textbooks and being tested on how much you knew. And what I learned at Oxford was that university education is quite different, and you're not mugging things up out of textbooks. We didn't have textbooks at all. You learn things from original research literature in the library. For the weekly tutorial, which was almost unique, as an Oxford and Cambridge tradition, that you go for a whole week in the library, reading up a subject which you're assigned by the tutor, and then at the end of the week you go to the tutor, and in my day you would read out your essay. You'd read it aloud, which gives you sort of training in making it sound good and making it clear. By the way, a nice story, my uncle, who was at the same college much earlier, of course, he had the same thing of having to read an essay aloud. And he was rather fond of playing rugby, and so he hadn't actually done much work for this particular essay. And so he copied it all out of a book. And he was reading it out, and his tutor silently got up from his chair, went over to the bookshelf, picked a book off the shelf, opened it, looked through it, and then started following with his finger. And then at the end, he snapped the book shut and said, "I see you agree with Mr. So-and-so." Well, I didn't do that, I'm proud to say. I actually took the tutorials very seriously. That was the making of me, the tutorial system. The tutors that I had were very varied. I had a different tutor every term, usually on their own specialist subject. So you had a sort of world expert in the subject. You're reading an essay out to this world expert. Actually, the undergraduate himself, if he'd done his work properly in the library, had already become a world expert in the subject because he was the most recent person to have read it up. But I had some inspiring tutors. I mean, one that I think of was Arthur Kane, who had me reading philosophy and history of biology rather than anything that I might ever get asked in an exam. It would never have occurred to him to prepare me for the exam. He was preparing me to be a scholar, and that was wonderful, to be treated as a scholar and to be invited to write an essay in a scholarly way, to look at the literature, evaluate opposing points of view, come to a decision, argue this way, argue that way. Totally different from the school experience. Another tutor that I had was Nico Tinbergen, who later became my doctoral supervisor. He was the great ethologist, the great animal behavior student. He later got a Nobel Prize. And his style of tutoring, again, had no relation to what you might get in an exam. His style of tutoring was to give me a PhD thesis to read. And I had to spend the week reading the PhD thesis and then write an essay, which was a sort of almost like an examiner's report on the PhD thesis. I had to write about the theoretical background to the thesis, criticize the work of the thesis, criticize the experiments, and then say what more could be done, how you might carry on the research in the future. So that was a very different style, again, having little to do with preparing for exams, but having a lot to do with real scholarship.
How many pages were those weekly reports?
Mine were exceptionally long. So, in fact, reading them out, I actually sometimes didn't finish reading it by the end of the hour. But mostly they're shorter than that. Mostly they're about 6 pages. Mine were about 20 pages. Mm-hmm. Not very proud of that, actually.
And is that tradition continuing at Oxford and Cambridge?
Yes, it is. Nowadays, they tend not to read it aloud. Nowadays, they tend to hand it in ahead of time.
Email it?
Probably email it, yes, that's right, which doesn't give you much practice for writing in the exam, where you have to handwrite.
Mm-hmm. Sneezes, improbable events that seem minor or major, can determine major paths in our lives. And in fact, that we are all alive at all, as you have pointed out. Did you recall the incident that led to your invitation to come to Berkeley?
Yes. Not exactly a sneeze, but it was a difficult moment. My doctoral research I won't go into it, but it involved a mathematical model of what might be going on inside an animal's head when it makes a decision. And I wanted to build a model of what I thought was going on inside the animal's head. So I got a glass tube filled with mercury and a rubber tube at the bottom filled with mercury. And by jiggling the rubber tube up and down, the mercury column went up and down, and it hit electrodes which were let into the tube at different heights. And that, I won't go into why, but that had significance for the model. But I wanted to place this thing on the bench in a conference hall, where I went in Zurich in Switzerland to give a talk about my research. So I was going to place this thing on the bench and have a spectacular demonstration, as I hoped. The whole Rube Goldberg affair was calculated to bring the house down. How I managed to transport it from Oxford to Zurich evades my memory and indeed my comprehension. There's not a chance that today's airport security would allow anything remotely like it through, bristling as it was with amateurly soldered wires, relays, batteries, and mercury. Alas, just as I was about to go on the big stage for my first ever conference performance, something went wrong with my contraption, and it wouldn't work. In a sweat of panic and unable to think straight, I was kneeling on the floor outside the theatre, frantically tinkering, when I suddenly became aware of an amused Austrian accent barking out peremptory orders at great speed behind me. The rapid-fire, stuttering voice told me exactly what to do. As in a dream, I obeyed. And it worked. I turned to look at my saviour and beheld Wolfgang Schleidt, whom I hadn't previously met, although I knew who he was. Without any prior knowledge of what my infernal machine was supposed to do, this rising star of continental ethology had come upon my panic, instantly sized up the problem, and dictated the solution to me. I've been grateful ever since to Dr. Schleidt, who had, as I later learned without surprise, a reputation for technical ingenuity. I bore my strange device up into the theatre, and at the end of my talk, its spluttering coloured lights and air of Rube Goldberg amateurishness received a reception little short of an ovation. Thank you, Wolfgang Schleidt, and for more than saving my blushes. For in the audience that day was the handsome figure of George Barlow, rising star of American ethology, and he was sufficiently impressed by my talk to get me invited to become an assistant professor at the University of California at Berkeley, without an interview or submission of a curriculum vitae, my first proper job.
Right, so that was quite an event. You were out.
Another lucky break, yes.
Right,
yeah.
So how do you think, what would have happened if you'd taken your contraption up and it didn't work?
Well, I wouldn't have got the ovation, that's for sure.
Berkeley might not have been in the cards either.
That's right. I do have a reflection towards the end of the book about, I think I read a bit about sneezes earlier, didn't I? And the happenstance that a dinosaur happened to sneeze or not sneeze, I forget which way around I put it, and the effect that would have had knock-on effects throughout the rest of the next 100 million years, which would have seen to it that none of us were here. Somebody else might be here, but something as inconsequential as a sneeze. Your grandfather sneezed long before you were born, and that had a knock-on effect which affected which of many possible spermatozoa hit which possible eggs which were necessary in order for you to exist. There's a poem by Aldous Huxley, which expresses it rather well. Shall I do it?
Sure.
Yeah. A million spermatozoa, all of them alive. Out of their cataclysm, but one poor Noah dare hope to survive. And of that billion minus one might have chanced to be Shakespeare, another Newton, a new Donne. But the one was me. Shame to have ousted your betters thus, taking ark while the others remained outside. Better for all of us, froward homunculus, if you'd quietly died. We all of us have no right to exist. It's fantastically improbable that we do. But once we did exist, once we came into existence, then events like my model in Zurich happening to work, I mean, they still have, they still constitute lucky or unlucky breaks. But once you've been conceived, your chances of existing become billions of times more likely than they were before you were conceived. And then after that, little things like whether your model worked on the stage in Zurich, they're still pretty lucky. But,
right. Well, you're alive.
Yeah.
But do you think you would have taken the path?
I would not have gone to Berkeley. I wouldn't have been invited to go to Berkeley. Actually, ironically, the place I would have gone was Maryland to work with Dr. Schleidt, because that was where I was going to go, as it turned out.
You studied animal behavior in the 60s. B.F. Skinner was having an impact at that time. Skinner has been misunderstood, much like Darwin's work was. He essentially discovered that much behavior during an organism's lifetime is selected by reinforcing consequences in parallel to the natural selection of genes across lifetimes. How did you regard his work then, and how do you regard it now?
I actually heard Skinner lecture. He came to lecture in Oxford. He must have been quite old, and I went along with lots of other people to hear him. I was introduced to his work by an enthusiast at Oxford who gave a research talk about it. He has become somewhat unfashionable. I'm not quite sure why, but the aspect that, Greg, you've mentioned is I think, right, that he's spotted an analogy between reinforcement learning and natural selection. In natural selection, random mutations are favored or disfavored according to whether they survive, usually whether the animal survives, but often whether the animal reproduces. So there is random variation and then non-random survival. The analogy, of course, is with the animal, say the pigeon in a Skinner box or the rat in a Skinner box, doing random behavior, and the human who designs the Skinner box determines whether or not the behavior shall be rewarded, usually with food reward. So that's the analog of natural selection. The random behavior is not exactly random, but it's a sort of spontaneous trying out, trial and error by the pigeon. In conventional Skinner boxes, it's usually a food reward, and it's rewarded for pecking at a key. But you can do more interesting things, like do the reward by hand and watch the animal and wait until it does something. And then if it does the thing you want it to do, reward it. And so it's called shaping. And you can make the animal do essentially anything you like by waiting until it does something, just a little step towards the right thing. If you want to make it, say, spin round and round like a ballet dancer, you can wait until it looks over its left shoulder, reward it. Do that a few times, then wait till it looks a bit further over its left shoulder, reward it. Then wait till it turns its whole body, reward it. Then wait till it goes all the way round and reward it.
Water?
Then wait till it does it twice, and so on. And so you can get it to do really whatever you like. And it is the basis of by far the most successful way of training any animal to do anything. Circus animals are trained in this way, in Skinner's way. So it's a remarkably successful way of training. And even more interesting, perhaps, is Skinner's experiments on superstitious behavior, where instead of deliberately rewarding the animal for what you want it to do, you set the rewarding mechanism in the Skinner box to go off at random. So the animal forms superstitious beliefs that something that it did caused the reward to happen. In fact, the reward comes entirely at random. You can see the resemblance to human superstitious behavior, sacrificing a goat to make the rains come or something of that sort. They once sacrificed a goat, and it happened to rain, so ever since then they've always sacrificed a goat. So if you set the Skinner box schedule to reward the bird at random, and you just leave it like that, you can have 6 Skinner boxes, all with different birds in, and you leave them with the reward mechanism going off at random, and you come back after some time, and you find that each bird is doing something odd. One of them might be spinning around and round, one of them might be looking up like that, one of them might be preening its left wing, one of them might be scratching at the ground. Each one of them has happened to do something immediately before a reward, and this has had to have happened a few times, and they're all doing a different superstitious behavior. It's as though they've all got a different religion.
Yes. So at the time you were at Oxford and in school, what was the general feeling then about the theory of natural selection? Watson and Crick had recently discovered the mechanism of DNA replication. What was the atmosphere like at that time?
I don't think Watson and Crick had an immediate effect on the way people thought about evolution, oddly enough. when I was at Oxford, of course we knew about Watson and Crick and learned about it, but it didn't really come into evolution. The Oxford genetics at that time was dominated by a fastidious old aesthete called E.B. Ford, who had long worked on butterflies in the field. He more or less invented the subject of ecological genetics, studying genetics in the field, trapping butterflies or moths or other creatures, and looking at the genetics over geography, looking at changes in gene frequencies as measured by, I don't know, spots on the butterfly's wings or something. So for Ford's kind of work, he was studying evolution, and he did study evolution, evolutionary change over generations, the kind of thing that's been more recently done by Peter and Rosemary Grant in the Galapagos Islands with Darwin's finches, where you study something, they study beak length and beak width and things in successive generations and show how astonishingly fast natural selection can go. And that sort of thing was pioneered by Ford at Oxford with his pupils, people like Arthur Kane, whom I mentioned earlier. The Watson and Crick revolution has had an enormous impact on evolutionary studies more recently than that. It's become clear that genetics is a branch of information technology. It's a branch of computer science. Genes work just like data processing machines. It's a quaternary code, not a binary code, but apart from that, it's exactly like computer data with the same high fidelity, the same low probability of mistakes occurring, which are very important in evolution, of course, but they do have very low probability. In general, it's extreme high fidelity. The realization that all living creatures, every living creature that's ever been looked at, has the same genetic code. The machine code of every living creature is the same. All that's different is I suppose you could call them high-level languages. You could the way in which the machine code is used to build the animal, that may be different. But the machine code is identical, almost identical. And it's digital. With hindsight, I think we can probably say that it had to be digital in order for natural selection to work. Not only it had to be digital, it had to be very high-fidelity digital as well. The molecular revolution has enabled us, people, to work out the exact closeness of cousinship of any two animals you like, limited only by the time and expense of actually sequencing the genome. But you can take any animal you like a hedgehog and a kangaroo, and work out how many genes, literally how many letters of the genetic alphabet they have in common, and work out the closeness of their cousinship by that. And but making a few additional assumptions, you can work out how long ago the common ancestor of any two animals lived. It gets harder the more distant they are. But for something like rats and mice, which are very closely related, you can do it for much more accurately. So the molecular revolution has enormously changed the whole study of evolution.
New feature coming to 23andMe soon. Have you done your own genome with a company like 23andMe?
Well, actually, better than that. I've had my entire genome done. The normal thing is just to do the sort of medically interesting things, the things that tell you whether you're going to go get Alzheimer's or whatever. I had my entire genome done, not at my own expense, I hasten to add. This was done by a television company who had the idea. It's rather a good, actually it was my idea, rather a good idea. It didn't quite come off, but my genome was sequenced before and once they decided to spend the money on getting my genome sequenced, the fact that the plan didn't come off didn't matter. They went ahead and did it anyway and used it for a slightly different television program.
And what did you find?
Well, the plan was that I would have my complete genome sequenced, and it would be put on a disk, and it would be buried in the Dawkins family vault in Chipping Norton Church. And the idea was that we would speculate that in 1,000 years' time, somebody would dig it up And by then they would had easily have the technology to make a clone of me. And so the conceit is a typical television program, you can tell. The conceit of the program was that I would use this as a vehicle to discuss the ethics of cloning, discuss what clones actually are, and that would involve, since it's television, going and interviewing identical twins who are, of course, clones of each other. Some people had the sort of misgiving that if you clone somebody, the clone would be a kind of zombie without a personality. So the plan was that I would go and talk to identical twins and say, which one of you has the personality, which one of you is the zombie? and I was going to discuss the ethics of cloning. I was going to deliver little homilies to my unborn twin to be born a millennium hence. Don't make the mistakes I made. Maximize the chances of the luck of your thing.
Did you find out things like, what percentage Neanderthal? And...
No, that could be done. The disc. I possess the disc, and the raw material is there for somebody to do that research. But it doesn't just pop out. I mean, you have to actually process the data.
And now the cost for that has really come down to like $100.
It's coming down all the time. Yeah. Moore's law, the law that says that computer power measured in various ways doubles, I think it's every 18 months. There's a similar law, which I call Hodgkin's law, because I suggested it to my colleague Jonathan Hodgkin, and he said, "Oh, I've done that already." He had looked at the equivalent of Moore's law for gene sequencing, and gene sequencing goes back sufficiently far that you can do the calculation, and it does indeed fall on a straight line on a log scale. It is exponential. The doubling time, I think, is not quite as fast as computer power. It's something like 27 months. And it probably largely depends on Moore's law because gene technology is so heavily dependent on computer technology. I don't think anybody understands, by the way, why Moore's law works, why the rate of increase in computer power should be exponential and at the same rate. Because it can't be just a simple, straightforward effect. I mean, computer power depends on all sorts of different things. So it must be some kind of curious averaging effect. You probably get a better idea than I have about that, Greg, what might cause Moore's law.
This is a conversation with you.
Yeah, okay.
So is there anything, given the advances that we see in science in so many different fields, anything that you see that's been very exciting in the last 10 or 15 years, such that if you were a graduate student today, what would you venture to go into?
Well, that's a slightly different question because...
well, break it up. What's exciting to you, and then what would you pursue?
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate to visit a splendid research centre on this visit. What's it called? Damn, I've forgotten the name. Something Farms near Washington. Janelia Farm, thank you. Where I was shown 2 or 3 research projects and was kind of transported back to my graduate student days with the feeling of, gosh, if only I'd had this apparatus, this technique, this what a phenomenal amount has happened. In one project that I remember was studying the way dragonflies hunt their small insect prey, and they do it visually. They've got huge compound eyes, and there's some kind of tie-up between the position of a moving target in this sort of round the spherical eye, and it's automatically wired up to the steering apparatus of the dragonfly. But the way they can look at the detail, the instrumentation they've got is so fantastic. They have, well, the dragonfly wears a little rucksack on its back, which has a radio transmitter in it, and it's got electrodes in the individual neurons, insect neurons, unlike our neurons, are individually recognizable and nameable. So you can put a neuron in a particular named neuron, put an electrode in a particular named neuron, and the readout comes from the radio transmitter in the rucksack on the dragonfly's back. But at the same time, the behavior is being monitored by a ring of about 20 video cameras, which are pointing in all directions at the dragonfly. And so you've got a complete kind of spherical readout of everything that the dragonfly does. And this is high-speed cinematography. So it's played back as time-lapse, and so you can see the wings slowly moving like this as the dragonfly actually flies very fast. You can see the head turning, you can see the steering movements, and all the time, along with that, you've got the readout from the electrodes in the individual neurons. If somebody had presented that research at that conference in Zurich in 1965, whenever it was, we would have been blown away. And so that it would be a very exciting time to go into the very field that I did go into. But I think that if you ask me what I would do if I wasn't going to be a biologist, I think I'd be a computer scientist. Mm-hmm. And my whole life has been bedeviled, as you see from the book, by a kind of addiction to the vice of computer programming. Nowadays, you don't have to program computers. You buy the stuff off the shelf, but when I started, you couldn't do that. You had to write your own programs, and so I learned a lot of programming languages, including machine code. I even invented some of my own programming languages, and thank goodness I shook off that vice, because I recognize that there are professionals who can do that kind of thing a hell of a lot better than I can.
Great. So, given all the reviews and reactions that you've received for the book so far, if this were just a draft and you had a chance to rewrite it, what would you add, subtract, or change?
I might change the way it's ordered. I mean, I've ordered it chronologically, and I think on the whole that probably is the best way of doing it. So I just go straight through my life from beginning to end. Well, not end. I stopped this. This is actually volume 1. I signed a contract to do the whole thing. And then when I got halfway through, when I got to the age of 35 and publication of The Selfish Gene, I thought, I need a break. And so I asked the publisher if I could stop and make it into two volumes. And so and it was actually a pretty neat break point. The publication of my first book was a watershed event in my life. It did completely change my life, and other things that changed it. So it was a good point, a good place to stop. I think it probably is the right thing to have done this volume chronologically. I think that was the right thing to do. But I might actually, in volume 2, I might do that non-chronologically and do that thematically, have a chapter on television, a chapter on Friends, a chapter on, people like Douglas Adams, who I knew well enough to be able to write something about, or Christopher Hitchens. That is a possibility to do it thematically. Another thing that was suggested to me by somebody who actually interviewed me on this tour was that I should do it chronologically, but start at the end and do it a flashback, like they do, like films often do. So start with, say, the night when I presented Volume 1 to a magnificent audience in Stanford, and go back from there. And then I thought, well, I could generalize this principle of the flashback and have an imagined deathbed scene.
With Brad Pitt as Richard Dawkins.
So I don't know. I actually would welcome suggestions for how to do Volume 2. Volume 1 is straight chronological.
And when will we expect to see the second half?
Contractually, it's got to be published in 2015. But as Douglas Adams said of deadlines, I do love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound as they go by.
Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Dawkins. Now I believe we're going to have some question and answer from the audience. It's going to be moderated here.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to have some people go around with mics. You raise your hand, and they'll come around to you, and I'll pick you. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question or two first as they get set up. As you describe it in the book, and as you described it tonight, your childhood doesn't necessarily lead one to believe that you were destined to be a great biologist. I'm just wondering, it sounds almost like when you got to Oxford, it was less of an appetite, but more that you got hungry when they put the banquet in front of you. So can you explain the title of the book?
Yes, you're right. It was my African childhood did not actually turn me into a naturalist, as it might have done. I think partly because, for one reason or another, I never actually saw an elephant or a lion. I did see lions actually, but I wasn't exposed to the great national parks, which people tend to be when they go to Central and East Africa now. My parents are both rather good naturalists, and I wasn't as good as them. So it's true that it wasn't until I got to Oxford that I acquired the appetite you're talking about. It's you really want to know where the title came from? It came from the publisher.
That was my guess.
Yeah. I rather favoured the title that my wife Lala suggested, which was a slight variation on Tolstoy's childhood autobiography. His was childhood, boyhood, youth. And Lala suggested, and I rather liked, childhood, boyhood, truth. And that was the title I was using for quite a lot of the writing of it.
I like that title.
But the American publisher thought that not enough readers would get the Tolstoy illusion, and vetoed it. My original working title was A Patchwork of Memories, because it is very largely based on memory. There are extracts from my mother's diaries of my childhood, but apart from that, it's entirely based on memory.
We're going to begin with a lofty question up in the balcony here.
I want to start with a brief warning that a question is a short interrogatory phrase ended by a question mark, not a rambling speech. So please keep your questions short.
The rambling speech is in the answer, I fear.
Professor Dawkins, you didn't really talk much about religion, but because this is a humanist meeting, I thought I could ask. You seem to, in your writings, I interpret it as the perfectibility of humans in using reason that is available to all of us. But something I never heard you comment on is whether you are an 8 sigma person, Harris is an 8 sigma person, Hitchens an 8 sigma person.
Sorry, I don't know the meaning of that word.
An 8 sigma, 8 sigma away from the mean. Just it was.
But
in any case,
as in standard deviation.
What you think about whether there's a large fraction of the population that is wired so as to sort of require something as compelling as what religion offers that you don't experience. Sorry.
How could I answer that without sounding patronizing?
And you were roped in you did believe as a child.
I was a child, and children do. As St. Paul said, when I was a child, I thought as a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. So yes, it's clear that religion is a human universal in the sense that all cultures, I think, that have been looked at by anthropologists have something that you could call religion. But it's equally clear that not all individuals have this need. And if you examine the psychology behind it, it's arguable that a great many more people would not be religious if they were adequately educated. I wouldn't like to say whether there is some innate compulsion that makes some people incapable of changing this particular thing. There is some evidence from twin studies that there is a genetic component to religiosity. As you know, twin studies is one rather good way to decide what proportion of the variance is of genetic origin. If you study identical twins reared together and identical twins reared apart, and compare it with fraternal twins, non-identical, dizygotic twins reared together and reared apart, you could make a pretty good calculation of the contribution to the variance of genes, in this case variance in religiosity. And there is a genetic component. That's to say, if one identical twin is religious, the chances are good that the twin will also, the other one will also be religious, even if they're reared apart. There's a population of a few dozen identical twins who, for accidental reasons, happen to have been reared apart. So I have a sort of confident hope that if we could once break the cycle of children automatically being brought up, indoctrinated with the religion of their parents, if we could break that cycle, that we might be able to get rid of religion altogether. But I have no idea whether that's true.
Okay, come on up. Let's take one more. Yeah, if you have a question, we'll make a little line up here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, please line up behind the questioners if you want to ask a question. That'll make it easiest to get to everyone.
Okay, great.
Professor Dawkins, first of all, I love your work. Thank you. I'm actually a raised Mormon, and you've given me a lot to think about over the years, so thank you. Do you see your career as having a trajectory of sorts? With the selfish gene, you were able to popularize a lot of the reasoning behind Darwinism, and I would say from an outsider's perspective, it looks like with the God delusion, that was kind of the peak of your atheist activism, and then your work since then has, especially with this memoir, focused more on your life, etc. Do you see yourself in the future going more toward or away from a certain field of practice?
The book immediately after The God Delusion was purely about science. That was the greatest show on earth. And the next one, The Magic of Reality, was a children's book about science. So it's certainly true that almost all my books have been about science. And that, I think, is what I shall continue to do. I thought possibly, when I finished volume 2 of this, I thought possibly of another children's book, using perhaps the same formula as The Magic of Reality, which is each chapter being about a particular scientific question, and each chapter beginning with mythological answers to the question. Questions like, what is the sun? What is a rainbow? What is an earthquake? Which children might well ask. And then mythological answers from all over the world, and then the scientific answer. That's a formula that I think works quite well. I think it worked quite well for The Magic of Reality. And I did it for a dozen scientific questions. I could perhaps do it for another dozen scientific questions. So that might be the next thing I do after the second volume of the autobiography. But I don't know. I mean, other people might want to suggest other things I could do. That's if I don't sneeze myself to death.
Okay, so the first floor is feeling slighted. Go ahead.
What would you say is your biggest regret or mistake you've made, either personally or professionally?
Well, perhaps we'll leave personal out of it. Although I will tell a story about the great poet, great English modern poet, Sir John Betjeman, who was asked towards the end of his life, Sir John, you've had a long and interesting life. Is there anything you regret? And he said, not enough sex. So that's not, I'm not answering this personally. I suppose if you added up the number of hours amounting to years that I spent programming computers to do things which other people could do better. And Douglas Adams expresses the vice rather well. You have a particular problem to solve, and you need to program a computer to solve it. And you could actually write the program in an afternoon. But instead, you write the program in such a way that it's user-friendly for anyone else in the world to do, even though you're the only person who actually wants to do it. And you give it all sorts of, nowadays you give it all sorts of fancy pull-down menus and resizable windows and things, because it's such fun. Whereas actually you could write a quick and dirty program that would do the job in a fraction of the time. And I always succumbed to that vice. Whenever I wrote a computer program, I had half an eye on the negligible possibility that somebody else might ever want to use it. Actually, some of my programs other people did use, to be fair, but that wouldn't have mattered. I just did it anyway. And so I think if you totted up the total number of man decades that I have to say pretty much wasted on being a perfectionist computer programmer, that would be my biggest regret.
At least that's the one you're saying.
One thing real quick before more questions, we want to especially encourage undergraduates and women to ask questions. Please ask questions.
Hi.
Could you wave wherever you are?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
A quick question about the balance between chance and order in evolution. So would you think that the main events in evolution, like the development of multicellular organisms, the movement from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells, and also in the later stages, the development of consciousness in human evolutionary stage, are more opportunistic developments in the evolutionary pattern, or do you think there are some rules that given enough time these things would evolve in a sufficiently hospitable planet?
A fascinating question, and it's one that you don't have to rely purely on imagination to answer, because there are one or two observations you can actually make. I mean, one thing you can say is that in different geographical areas, parallel evolution has taken place. And so you can say, if you compare, say, the evolution of Australian mammals, which are almost all marsupial, to the entirely separate evolution of mammals in South America, which was an island at the time, after Gondwana split, and the more familiar mammals of the rest of the world, you see uncanny similarities, parallels between, say, flying squirrels in the Old World and indeed in North America, and marsupial flying squirrels, flying phalangers in Australia. They are really uncannily alike. The marsupial wolf, Thylacynus, which only recently went extinct in Tasmania. It went extinct, I think, in 1935 in Tasmania. There's film of it, rather grainy black and white film of the last specimen in Hobart Zoo. Uncannily like a dog, but a marsupial. And the parallels go on. So there are things you could predict about evolution from comparing parallel evolution in different geographical areas. Perhaps even more penetrating is if you look at independent evolutions in different animal groups, never mind about geographical areas. Eyes have evolved. It's been calculated at least 40 times independently the eye has evolved. So to about 9 different designs. So you could probably predict that eyes are going to evolve. That's going to be a fairly determined thing, that so long as there's light and not too much fog about, eyes are likely to evolve. Echolocation, sonar, is much less likely to evolve. It's only evolved 4 times. Bats, toothed whales, and two different families of birds, both dwelling in caves, finding their way about in the dark by shrieking echoes and listening for the echoes and piecing together a picture of the world from that. That's evolved 4 times, so that's got a kind of moderate degree of predictability. Intelligence of a human kind, or let's say language, grammatical language, has only evolved once. And so that probably has a much lower level of predictability. You probably wouldn't predict that if my hypothetical dinosaur had sneezed, maybe some other shrew-like animal might have produced mammals that would look pretty much like the mammals that we have. We can guess that from the Australian experience, but the chance that one would produce language like human language might be rather low. That could be a very, very lucky accident. So I think it's sort of a question it's lovely to speculate about, and we can even deploy some zoological knowledge in order to come up with the sort of answer. You can go on with it, looking at other things. I just did eyes and echolocation, but you could do lots of other things as well. I mean, wings have evolved. True flight has only evolved, I think, 4 times. But insects, birds, pterodactyls, and bats. But gliding has evolved a lot of times. Gliding frogs, gliding snakes, gliding squirrels, gliding lizards, gliding lemurs. So gliding is pretty predictable. Flying, yes, maybe.
Do we have a female undergraduate at the back of that line? Go.
All right. Maybe while you're looking for one, we'll do one up here. Here you go.
Professor Dawkins, I read that in your book you mentioned...
So can you wave so I can see where you are?
To the up left.
Oh, yes. Hello, yes.
I read that in your book you mentioned you were inspired by William Hamilton and John Maynard Keynes. Could you elaborate on what you find inspiring in these people?
William Hamilton, actually Maynard Smith, not Maynard. Maynard Keynes was the economist. Yeah. I was inspired by Maynard Smith. Anyway, never mind. Yes, Hamilton was the chief inventor or discoverer of the theory of what Maynard Smith actually called kin selection. Hamilton referred to his theory as inclusive fitness. The fact, and it is a fact because it follows logically from the neo-Darwinian synthesis, that if a gene arises that causes an animal to behave altruistically towards kin, not just its own offspring, but collateral kin, if such a gene were to arise, then there would be a selection pressure in favor of it. So that's why many bird species, elder siblings care for their younger siblings, and mammals too. Above all, of course, it's the social insects, the ants, bees, wasps, and termites, in which elder siblings care for their younger siblings or nieces and nephews. And the reason is that they contain genes which they share above the average you'd expect from the population at large with these collateral kin. And after Hamilton, we now realize that parental care, which of course is part of classical Darwinism, parental care is only a special case of kin-selected care. Offspring share 50% of their genes with their parents, as do siblings. And so, as far as the genetics is concerned, the pressure to look after siblings is just as strong as the pressure to look after offspring. It's just that the opportunities to look after offspring are greater than the opportunities to look after siblings. And that's an important part of the Hamilton formulation. It's not just the kinship that matters, it's the benefits and costs that depend upon the ecology, the economy of the animal concerned. Maynard Smith, another English geneticist, was largely responsible for introducing the mathematical theory of games into evolutionary biology. And it's extremely fruitful to use game theory to account for any time when animals are in conflict with each other. They don't have to be members of the same species, but they can be, or when they're cooperating. And there are two main reasons why animals might cooperate. One is the kinship, which Hamilton elucidated, and the other is reciprocation, the possibility, the statistical chance of having a good deed repaid later. And you need game theory in order to work out exactly how that will work. And so both Hamilton's kinship theory and Maynard Smith's game theory were very prominent in my own first book, The Selfish Gene. They were both highly influential on me, and I knew them both and loved them both. They were both very different personalities. Maynard Smith was a garrulous, a sociable, humorous person. Students loved him. He was always surrounded by crowds of students learning from him, laughing with him. He was very different from typical professors who spend all their time worrying about money, where they're going to get their next grant from. Maynard Smith talked about science, and his research was always done with a pencil and paper anyway, so he didn't really need money. He was a wonderful man, as was Hamilton in another way. Hamilton was just the opposite. He was intensely shy. He was a rather lugubrious character in some ways. Do you read A.A. Milne? Do you read Winnie the Pooh in this country? He was Eeyore. I mean, just one anecdote about him, which is very Eeyore-ish. He once came in. I used to have lunch with him very often, and he once came into lunch with a paper clip on his glasses, just on the bridge of the nose, where the two lenses are joined. And I said to him, "Bill, why have you got a paper clip on your glasses?" And he said, "Do you really want to know?" So I said, yes, Bill, I really, really want to know. And he said, "Well, I find that my glasses sit rather heavily on my nose, so I fasten them up with a lock of my hair." That is a very typical story. He was a genius. Maynard Smith said he's the only bloody genius we've got.
Hi. So
Can you wave?
She's down here to the right.
Right, okay, yes.
I'm sure you're familiar with Bertrand Russell and his teapot analogy, that if someone claims that there's a teapot orbiting the Earth, then you can't say that that's true on the basis that you can't prove it wrong. And my question is, why atheism over agnosticism? Why certain belief that God doesn't exist over uncertainty?
Well, why atheism rather than agnosticism? I think Russell's point would be that technically we are all agnostic. We have to be agnostic. We can't actually prove the non-existence of anything. It's always vulnerable to somebody finding one. So we can't. I mean, that's the point of the teapot. That you cannot disprove the teapot, but that doesn't provide any decent reason for positively believing it. Nobody is going to start a cult of teapots because on the off chance that there might be a teapot in orbit around the sun. Though oddly enough, when I wrote that once, and then somebody went and sent me a picture from, I think, Malaya, of a giant teapot, which was indeed the subject of a religious cult. But I think Russell's point remains that you cannot go through a long list of things that might exist which you can't disprove. The list is infinite. It's not just teapots, it's coffee pots, it's
paper clips,
it's one-eyed geigers, it's anything you care to mention might exist in space. Leprechauns might exist in the Irish bogs. But because there's an infinite number of such things, and the probability of any one of them existing, the burden of proof is on somebody who wishes to show that leprechauns or celestial teapots exist. And exactly the same thing is true of anything else you might be agnostic about, such as Thor's hammer, such as Zeus's thunderbolts, and such as Yahweh and all his works. So we are technically agnostic about all those things that we can imagine but not disprove. But we await somebody coming up with positive evidence that any of them exist before we bother to stir ourselves to worship them or pray to them or ask them to forgive our sins.
Well, was Hitchens, quote, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence?
I think that was somebody else, but yes, it's a good quote, yes.
So we'll take one more down here.
Hi, Professor.
Wave, please, wave, can you?
Right here to the right.
Right, thank you.
Americans have always been fascinated with British public intellectuals, and they've always been very popular in America. And with you and Christopher Hitchens being really the two public faces of atheism and really the atheist movement over the past couple of decades in America, I was wondering if you thought this has affected or influenced or changed the way that atheism has been perceived and talked about in America as it's come into its new prominence.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that, since I don't live here. There are, I mean, just taking the Four Horsemen video that we made, Sam Harris and Dan Dennett are equally prominent and have written brilliant books. I strongly recommend their books, both of them. And there are several other American authors who I think are extremely important in this field. Going back in history, I mean, in Britain, we've got Bertrand Russell, who's just been mentioned. In America, you've got Robert Ingersoll. And I think the Anglo-American intellectual scene is pretty much seen as continuum, actually. I don't notice any difference when I come to America and mix with university people. I seem to detect no difference in the way we talk, the way we argue, the way we think. It is a bit different going to continental Europe, actually. But I think maybe it's the whole English-speaking world. I mean, it's the same in Australia. So no, I wouldn't make a big deal of the fact that Christopher and I happen to be English.
Richard, we're going to go up on the balcony over there, on the left.
Upper left.
Yes, thank you.
Good evening. I learned tonight that there are 0 atheists in the United States House of Representatives or the Senate, and I'm wondering what impact you think it might have on a country like ours if there were atheists represented in our higher levels of government.
Do you seriously believe there are no atheists in There are 535 members of the US Congress. Many of them are pretty well educated. It is statistically inconceivable that they are all religious, which must mean that a lot of them are lying. I don't blame them for lying, because they all believe what may be true and what may be a myth, that you cannot get elected in this country unless you profess religious belief and unless you say, God bless America at the end of every speech. That may be true, but I wish some of them would occasionally put it to the test. Poll figures, I understand, show that the number of non-believers, they're not necessarily atheists, but people who don't have any religion, they're called the nones, N-O-N-E, are now at 22% of the American population. That's a very high number. That compares with any other particular religious group. It doesn't compare with all religions added together, but it compares with, I think, any particular religious group. And maybe it's a bit of a myth that politicians are obliged to suck up to the religious vote, because maybe they need to suck up to the non-religious vote for a change, and maybe it's up to their constituents, people like you, not me because I'm not a citizen, to write to them and let them know this. There might come a tipping point when, one by one, they come out.
So just to follow up with that, you've expressed strong views on religion, as pointed out. Some people suggest that extreme views are more alienating than convincing. Others suggest that taking an extreme position is necessary to pull the majority of the public a bit closer to your thinking. Can you comment on the effect and the rationale for the intensity of your religious views?
Both points of
Religious
view,
criticism.
both ways of doing it might actually work. I think they might work on different people. I'm rather happy to have some people adopting the more conciliatory accommodationist approach, while some of us adopt. Mind you, I'm pretty conciliatory, actually. I mean, I'm quite soft-spoken. I don't yell. I don't yell like a preacher in a church. It's true that I have been known on occasion to employ the method of ridicule as opposed to the method of seductive persuasion. I think seductive persuasion works with some people, ridicule works with others. I myself was converted from an enthusiasm for the theologian Teilhard de Chardin and his book, The Phenomenon of Man, by P.B. Meadower's review of that book, the greatest negative book review ever written. He employed ridicule to the nth degree, and that it was ridicule that won me round. I mean, I saw my own view, my own enthusiasm being ridiculed, and I thought to myself, I've been an utter fool to have been taken in by this man. But I could well imagine that other people might have dug their toes in and said, no, you've insulted my belief. I'm pushing back. So some people push back, and perhaps I'm not the right person to talk to them. Other people might respond to the method that worked when Meadower used it on me.
So we'll take two last questions down from here.
Hi. So today the concept of memes has become critical in understanding how people interact online and how cultures are changing in a world where communications are increasingly hyperlinked. So I was just wondering, what drove you to apply genetic concepts and behaviors to culture in the first place? And did you ever expect the term meme to take off 2 or 3 decades after you originally coined it?
Well, you're right to say to apply genetic concepts, because it came in the last chapter of the first edition of the Selfish Gene. The second edition has 2 more chapters, but it's the last chapter of the original book. And the whole book had been emphasizing the gene as the unit of natural selection. Natural selection is the differential survival of genes in gene pools, and once you get that in your head, you do your sums right, you get it right. So it was a very important message that I was trying to put across. But having done that, I then didn't want to leave people with the impression that it always has to be DNA, that the Darwinian algorithm driving evolution depends upon genes in the sense of DNA. The Darwinian algorithm will work wherever in the universe you have self-accurate, high-fidelity, self-replicating information with power over its own chances of being replicated. On other planets, if there's life on other planets, I put my shirt on the life having evolved by something like Darwinian means. And that means there has to be something like a gene. But I would not put my shirt on it being DNA. It almost certainly wouldn't be DNA. And I wanted to emphasize the point, since we can't go to Mars, we can't go to Proxima Centauri and look at other life forms, by taking something familiar, which is human culture. Because in human culture, in human society, we have the phenomenon of imitation. And imitation is kind of gene-like. Ideas pass from brain to brain in the form of an imitated habit, an imitated clothes fashion, an imitated way of speaking, an imitated tune that you whistle. Any of these things can spread through the population like a virus, like a measles epidemic. And it's something like a school. A craze for a particular kind of toy, a particular game, spreads more or less exactly like a measles epidemic, with roughly the same time course and the same die-away curve. And it then may jump to another school because somebody's sister goes to the other school or something like that, and infects the other school. So it looks just like a virus. So I was able to illustrate the point that natural selection doesn't have to depend upon genes by using the idea of a meme, because then you can have natural selection of memes. Some survive better than others because a tune may be catchier than another tune, and therefore is more likely to be whistled in the street, more likely to be replicated like a gene, like a virus epidemic. And so that was my goal. I wasn't attempting to contribute to the theory of human culture at all. I was attempting to play down the gene as the only possible unit of natural selection. I'm interested that others have run with the idea of the meme. I mean, notably Daniel Dennett in several of his books, and Susan Blackmore in her book The Meme Machine. And actually there are now about 20 books with the word meme in the title. And it also, I mean, the internet is an obvious ecosystem for memes. And so, not surprisingly, the word meme is now rife on the internet as well.
Professor Dawkins, you are arguably the best known of the new atheists, which you mentioned the other three. I was wondering whether you view the term new atheist with pride or not. Also in view that, of course, atheism has a long tradition that you're aware, and it could just be that people are encountering it now for the first time.
Yes, I mean, there is actually very little that's new in what I've written about atheism, or I think my colleagues as well. I suppose, I mean, we sort of ram it home with modern examples, things that people will know about from their own life. Well, whereas Bertrand Russell, writing Why I'm Not a Christian, when did he write that? In the 1940s, was it? Or I'm not sure when he wrote that. You can read Russell with profit, very much so, today. But I suppose that, yes, I mean, the basic ideas of atheism, and there's nothing new, but it's kind of brought up to date, and with Christopher Hitchens' passion and political know-how, historical know-how, it has a kind of vividness which stamps it as contemporary. And I like to think that our other books do as well.
Well, I believe it's time to end the questions, and I have faith that John will bring a closure to this meeting. So,
thank you, everybody, for coming to our event. I wanted to let you folks know that Professor Dawkins is so gracious as to do a book signing outside. So, if you'd like, you can buy books right outside and then get them signed by Professor Dawkins. Just so you know, we're not going to have time to do individualized book signings or take pictures just because there's so many of us here tonight. Thank you so much for attending. And in an inversion of the way that I used to leave church services, I guess I'll say, go without God. Thank you, everybody.
Come on,